They say she was the face that launched 1,000 ships. That her beauty was so divine, so irresistible, that men left behind their wives, their children, their kingdoms, and sailed across the sea into a decade of slaughter. They say all of Troy burned because of her. A single woman, a stolen queen, Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman to ever walk the earth. It is one of the most famous stories in history. The love affair that toppled a city, the betrayal that shook an age, the war that forged legends. From the songs of Homer to the paintings of the Renaissance, Helen's name has carried through centuries. She is desire made flesh. She is ruin cloaked in beauty. She is myth given a crown. But what if I told you this was never true? What if Helen of Troy never existed? What if the greatest war story in human memory was not born of passion, but of propaganda? For 3,000 years, poets, priests, and politicians have told us the same tale, that the Greeks sailed to Troy because Paris stole Helen, and that men killed and died in her name. Yet when we strip away the verses, when we dig into the soil of ancient Troy, when we weigh myth against history, another truth begins to emerge. The truth is that Troy was real. The war was real. The burning of the city was real. But Helen, the divine beauty, the queen who doomed a city, was a fiction, a mask, a story invented to make sense of greed, blood, and conquest. This was never a tale of love. It was a tale of power, a tale of men who wanted to control the narrow strait between seas, who wanted wealth, who wanted dominance. To make their violence noble, they created Helen, the perfect excuse, the perfect scapegoat. Think of it. Which story would you rather hear? That men slaughtered each other for tolls and trade routes, or that they fought for a woman whose beauty could bend the world? The poets knew their audience. The storytellers knew what would endure. And so Helen was born. And yet, she endured longer than kings, longer than empires. Her name has lasted 3,000 years, while the stones of Troy crumbled and the bones of its dead turned to dust. That is the power of myth. That is the danger of lies. Picture it for a moment. Towers collapsing in flame, walls blackened by fire, the cries of the dying rising into the night. That destruction was real, but the cause was not a queen's beauty. It was ambition. It was greed. It was the hunger of kings for power. Tonight, we will strip away the veil. We will journey through the myths, the ruins, the politics, and the poetry. We will meet the Helen the ancients imagined, the Troy archaeologists uncovered, and the real war that scarred the Aegean world. This is not just a story about a war 3,000 years ago. It is a story about us, about how human beings turn greed into glory, how we use stories to excuse slaughter, how we prefer beauty to truth. They say she was the face that launched 1,000 ships. But what if it was never her face? What if it was a fortress, a trade route, a treasury of gold? What if it wasn't beauty, but power that brought Troy to its knees? Helen of Troy is the greatest lie in history. And tonight, we will expose it.
Before history claimed her, Helen belonged to myth. She was never a simple woman. She was the daughter of gods. The story begins not in Troy, not in Sparta, but on the banks of the Eurotas River in Greece. There, Leda, queen of Sparta, walked among the reeds. According to the poets, Zeus himself descended upon her, not as a man, but as a swan. The king of the gods took what he wanted, leaving Leda with 2 eggs. From those eggs, Helen was born. Already divine, already more than human, she carried with her the stain and blessing of Olympus. From birth, Helen was marked by beauty. Not the ordinary beauty of mortal women, but something otherworldly, dangerous, irresistible. The poets tell us that even as a child, she was kidnapped by Theseus, the hero of Athens, because her beauty promised glory. She was rescued, but her legend was already growing. When she came of age, every king of Greece sought her hand. Agamemnon of Mycenae, Ajax of Salamis, Odysseus of Ithaca. Men who would one day lead armies first gathered in Sparta as suitors. But her father Tyndareus faced a dilemma. How could he choose one without offending all? To favor one king was to earn the hatred of the rest. It was Odysseus who solved the problem. He proposed the oath of Tyndareus, that all who courted Helen must swear a sacred vow. Whoever married her, all others would defend that marriage, with their lives if necessary. Bound by honor, they agreed. And so Helen was wed to Menelaus, king of Sparta, brother of Agamemnon. For a time, peace reigned. Helen bore children, ruled beside her husband, and seemed settled into her role as queen. But her myth was not yet finished. Far away, in Troy, a prince was growing into manhood. His name was Paris. To the world, he was little more than a shepherd, but his destiny was shaped by a fateful contest. According to legend, 3 goddesses, Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, quarreled over who was the fairest. They turned to Paris to judge between them. Each offered him a bribe. Hera promised power. Athena promised wisdom. But Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Paris chose desire. He chose Aphrodite. He chose Helen. The rest was inevitable. Whether by abduction or elopement, Helen left Sparta and sailed with Paris to Troy. Some say she went willingly, enchanted by love. Others say she was stolen, carried screaming across the sea. But however it happened, the result was the same. Menelaus's pride was shattered, and the oath was invoked. Every king of Greece gathered his ships, not for trade or conquest, but for Helen. Or so the story goes. The myth is seductive because it is simple. A man steals a woman, her husband demands her return, and the world erupts in war. Beauty becomes the spark that lights the flame of legend. But notice how Helen is portrayed in these tales. She has almost no voice. She is spoken about, argued over, fought for, but rarely does she speak for herself. To Homer, to the tragedians, to the poets, she was less a woman than a mirror. A reflection of men's fears and desires. For some, she was a goddess of lust, a destroyer of men. For others, she was a victim of fate, a pawn in a game of gods and kings. In either case, she was an object, never an agent. The contradictions are striking. In one version of the myth, Helen never even went to Troy at all. Instead, the gods sent only her phantom while she remained hidden in Egypt. Troy burned, men died, and all of it was for a shadow. To some poets, this explained why she could later return to Sparta as queen, untainted, innocent, untouched by the war. What does this tell us? That Helen was never a fixed person. She was a story. She was a canvas upon which poets painted the fears of men and the dangers of desire. She could be guilty or innocent, seductress or victim, goddess or ghost. She was whatever the storyteller needed her to be. And this is what makes her dangerous. Helen was not just a character in a myth. She was propaganda, desire weaponized, beauty transformed into an excuse for war. She was a masked kings and poets' war to cover conquest with poetry. Picture Paris, the young prince of Troy, sailing across the wine-dark sea with Helen at his side. To the poets, this was destiny. To the kings who followed, it was justification. The poets made her immortal. They gave her power beyond empires. But beneath the verses, another truth lingers. Because if Helen was never real, then the war was not fought for love at all. It was fought for something far more human: greed, survival, and the hunger for power. And that truth, buried beneath centuries of verse, still waits for us in the ruins of Troy. The War of Troy, as the poets told it, was no ordinary war. It was the war. The war of gods and men, the war that set the foundation of Greek memory. In the songs of Homer, the Greek fleet stretched across the horizon like a forest of masts, 1,000 ships darkening the sea, each carrying kings and warriors bound for vengeance. When they beached their vessels on Trojan shores, the earth itself seemed to tremble. For 10 years, the Greeks fought. For 10 years, the Trojans resisted. Battles were not just between armies but between heroes, each larger than life, each destined for song. There was Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, invincible except for a single heel. There was Hector, Prince of Troy, noble and doomed, fighting not for glory but for his city and family. There was Odysseus, the cunning strategist, whose tongue was as sharp as his spear. And Paris, the lover, the thief of Helen, protected not by strength but by the goddess who had promised him her beauty. The Iliad gives us fragments of this war, flashes of blood and grief. It begins not with Helen, but with anger. Achilles, insulted by his commander Agamemnon, withdraws from battle. His pride becomes a weapon, and without him, the Greeks falter. The Trojans drive them back to the sea. Then comes the duel that changes everything: Hector against Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion. Patroclus, disguised in Achilles' armor, fights bravely but falls to Hector's spear. When Achilles learns of his friend's death, grief consumes him. His rage returns him to the battlefield like a storm breaking the sky. The clash of Achilles and Hector is the heart of the Iliad. Hector runs around Troy's walls 3 times, with Achilles chasing like a predator after prey. At last Hector falls, and Achilles, mad with grief and fury, drags his body behind his chariot, the dust swallowing the Prince of Troy. It is one of the most brutal images in all of literature. And above it all, the gods are never silent. Zeus weighs men's fates on his golden scales. Athena whispers courage into Greek ears. Apollo bends his bow, sending plague and death into the Greek camp. Aphrodite shields Paris from certain death. The war is never simply mortal. It is fought in heaven as much as on earth. After 10 years of blood, the city still stood. The walls of Troy, said to have been built by the gods, resisted every assault. And so the Greeks turned to cunning where force had failed. The story of the Trojan horse became the most famous trick in history. Odysseus, ever the trickster, conceived it, a massive wooden horse, left as a gift for the gods, hollow inside. Believing their enemies had fled, the Trojans dragged it into their city in triumph. But when night fell and the city slept, Greek warriors slipped out of its belly, opened the gates, and unleashed fire upon Troy. Flames swallowed the towers. Temples collapsed in ash. Men were cut down in the streets. Women and children were dragged into slavery. Priam, the aged king, was slaughtered on his own altar. The city that had resisted for a decade was gone in a single night. It is the kind of ending only myth could craft. A neat conclusion. A perfect trick. A city brought down by cleverness rather than force. A queen reclaimed, a war ended, legend secured. But was it ever real? Even Homer does not tell it this way. The Iliad ends not with Troy's fall but with Hector's funeral. The horse, the fire, the sack, these belong to later poets, later plays, later storytellers. Already the myth was shifting, growing, becoming larger and tidier than reality could allow. And when we look closely, contradictions appear everywhere. Heroes strike down dozens with single blows. Armies wait politely while champions duel. The gods walk the battlefield like generals. This is not history. This is theater. Yet within the theater are moments of piercing humanity. The grief of Achilles. The quiet bravery of Hector as he bids farewell to his wife and child. The sorrow of old Priam, begging his enemy for his son's body. These moments are too raw to dismiss. They suggest that behind the exaggeration, behind the divine interference, there was once a kernel of truth. But truth does not lie in poetry. It lies in the soil. Because beneath the ground of modern-day Turkey, archaeologists uncovered the real Troy. Its stones and bones tell us a story very different from Homer's. Not of gods and horses, but of fire, rubble, and war without romance. Homer gave us gods and heroes. The earth gives us fire, destruction, and bones. And it is to the earth that we now turn. For centuries, scholars debated whether Troy ever existed at all. To many, it was nothing more than a poet's invention, a mythical city, no more real than Atlantis. The Iliad was admired as epic poetry, but dismissed as fantasy. That changed in the late 19th century, when an unlikely man arrived in northwestern Turkey. His name was Heinrich Schliemann. He was no trained archaeologist, but a wealthy German merchant with an obsession. From childhood he had devoured Homer's verses, and he was convinced the poems were not fantasy but history in disguise. Where others saw myth, he saw a map. In 1870, Schliemann began digging into a mound called Hazarlik. Villagers had long known ruins lay beneath it, but Schliemann believed this was Troy. He dug with passion, and often with recklessness, tearing through layers with dynamite and haste. He destroyed as much as he uncovered. Yet his instinct was not entirely wrong. What he revealed stunned the world. Instead of one Troy, there were many. The mound held a stack of cities, 9 layers deep, each built atop the ruins of the last, a history written in stone, centuries of destruction and rebirth. Troy I, Troy II. All the way to Troy IX. Each city had its own walls, its own homes, its own people. Schliemann thought he had found Priam's Troy in the second layer, and when he unearthed a hoard of gold jewelry, he declared it Priam's treasure. But he was wrong. That treasure was 1,000 years too old. His imagination had outrun the evidence. Still, he had proved one thing beyond doubt: Troy was real. Later archaeologists, working with more care, Wilhelm Dorpfeld, Karl Blegen, Manfred Korfmann, would refine the picture. And among all those layers, one stood out. Troy VA. Destroyed around 1200 BCE, exactly when tradition places the Trojan War. The signs were unmistakable. Massive storage jars buried in the earth, filled with grain, showed a city preparing for siege. Cramped houses hastily built against the inside of the walls suggested refugees crowding into safety. Arrowheads and spear points littered the rubble. Human skeletons lay in twisted positions among the ashes. And above it all, the city had been consumed by fire. This was no peaceful abandonment. This was war. And the date matters. Around 1180 BCE, the entire Bronze Age world was collapsing. Kingdoms in Greece, Anatolia, and the Near East fell in flames. Troy's destruction fit into that wider chaos. But here, at last, was a place where archaeology and poetry touched. Homer had sung of a city besieged and burned. The ruins of Troy VIIA prove that such a city existed, and that it burned at exactly the right time. But what kind of city was this? Not a dream world of gods and heroes, but a real settlement of merchants, farmers, and soldiers. Its walls were real, massive stone fortifications rising above the plain, with towers and gates that could withstand years of attack. And its location was no accident. Troy stood at the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait linking the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. Whoever held Troy controlled the flow of trade between two worlds. Imagine the wealth that passed through those waters. Grain from the Black Sea's fertile plains, copper and tin for making bronze, luxury goods from distant lands. Every ship was vulnerable to tolls and taxes. Troy was the gatekeeper, the toll booth of empires. Now the legend begins to make sense. Not as a war for beauty, but as a war for power. The Mycenaean Greeks, the rising power of the Aegean, had every reason to seize such a city. To control Troy was to control trade, wealth, and influence. The ruins whisper this truth. They do not tell of Aphrodite's promises or of gods weighing fates on golden scales. They speak of ordinary people caught in conquest, families hoarding grain, refugees crowding behind walls, soldiers dying in streets of fire. The Iliad remembers only heroes. The earth remembers everyone. Schliemann's reckless work was only the beginning. Later excavations mapped the city's fortifications, revealed its bustling lower town, traced its connections to the wider Bronze Age world. Troy was not a myth. It was a hub of trade, culture, and power, and it was destroyed violently at the very time the Greeks told their stories of Helen and war. Here, finally, we see how myth grows from truth. Homer gave us Achilles and Hector, gods and horses. Archaeology gives us stone walls blackened by fire, spear points rusted in rubble, the bones of children in the ash. Two versions of the same event, one gilded by poetry, the other scarred by history. And so we can say with certainty, Troy was real. Its destruction was real. The war was real. But it was never fought for a woman's face. It was fought for power. The stones of Hazarlik do not sing of Helen. They do not know her name. But they carry scars of fire and silence, the marks of a city that lived, that burned, and that fell. The poets told us the war began with a woman. But the earth tells us it began with something else entirely, power. Look at a map. Troy stood at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait linking the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. To us, it may seem like a distant corner of the world, but in the late Bronze Age it was one of the most valuable pieces of land on Earth. Whoever controlled Troy controlled the lifeline of trade between two continents. Through those waters came the grain that fed hungry cities, the tin and copper that forged bronze, the gold, ivory, and textiles that symbolized wealth. Without that grain, Greek cities starved. Without that copper and tin, their swords grew dull. Every ship that passed was vulnerable to Troy's tolls, every cargo a prize. Troy was more than a city. It was a gate. And gates invite war. The Mycenaean Greeks understood this well. By the 13th century BCE, their palaces rose in stone across the Aegean, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, centers of kings who commanded armies and fleets. But one obstacle remained, Troy, the rival power at the edge of the Hellespont. Now the story begins to shift. Imagine the Greeks not as romantic heroes avenging a stolen queen, but as ambitious rulers eyeing a fortress that blocked their expansion. To them, Helen was never the reason. She was the disguise. Wars for love stir the imagination. Wars for tolls and trade sound cold. Yet men have always killed more readily for gold than for beauty. Archaeology supports this. Troy via, the city destroyed around 1200 BCE, shows signs of a long siege, refugees crowding behind walls, houses built hastily within cramped quarters, storage jars filled with grain, arrowheads buried in rubble. The Greeks themselves were in turmoil, their palaces falling at the end of the Bronze Age. This was a desperate age. And desperate ages breed desperate wars. The picture sharpens. Troy was not a passive victim but a thriving hub of trade, a city whose merchants grew rich, whose rulers charged tolls, whose walls made them powerful. To the Greeks, it was not Helen who mocked them. It was Troy's wealth. This was not romance. This was calculation. The war was not sparked by beauty, but by a strait, a fortress, a hunger older than poetry. Helen was never more than a mask. She was the story that made war noble, the disguise that made conquest legendary. She was propaganda, the most enduring ever told. And yet her lie triumphed. Because lies dressed in beauty outlived the truth. It was easier to believe men died for love than for tolls and trade. Easier to remember a queen's face than a king's ambition. That is why Helen matters. She shows us how myth can eclipse memory, how stories can outlast facts, how the past we inherit is not always the past that was. The Trojan War was real. But the war we remember, for love, for beauty, for destiny, was never fought. They say she was the face that launched 1,000 ships. But in truth, she was the lie that launched history's greatest story.